Hello, and welcome back to biology. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the nervous system. And the nervous system is a network of billions of nerve cells that are highly organized, and they form a rapid control center for the body. Now, I have a picture of a brain here, but just because you have a nervous system doesn't necessarily mean you have a brain. And I'm not talking about people, obviously. I'm talking about organisms in general, right? So there are a lot of invertebrate insects, right? All the arthropods, so the insects, crustaceans, all of those guys. They all have nervous systems, but they don't have brains. But they do have some sort of control center. We're actually not going to talk a whole lot or at all about invertebrates. So mostly we're going to talk about the nervous system that you're more familiar with, but I just wanted to point that out, okay? Now, the functions of the nervous system are to detect a sensation. That's receiving input. We like to call that a stimulus, okay? Then you have to integrate that stimulus, and that means to determine what it is and how intense it is, right? And the intensity of the stimulus is really an interesting thing because the way the neuron, which is the nerve cell, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute, works is that it has to generate what's called an action potential. And the action potential means that it's received enough stimulus to conduct an electrical signal down the neuron. Again, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But I want to point out right up front that the action potentials are all of the same magnitude, and so you have to have some other way to detect the intensity of the stimulus. And oftentimes it has to do with the number of times that it's stimulated, or the number of areas that are stimulated, right? And so there's that. So frequency of the action potentials or the number of neurons involved, okay? So what happens after you sense it and you integrate it? You react to it, and that's the response to the stimulus. And we're going to talk about how all those things work. But here's your first question. An organism that lacks an integration center cannot receive stimuli, will not have a nervous system, will not be able to interpret stimuli, or can be expected to lack myelinated neurons. That is a fun word, by the way, myelinated. Obviously, we haven't talked about that, so that's probably not the answer. But if you don't have an integration system, you can't interpret the stimuli. Okay, so that's number 3. Right? So let's talk about the organization. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So let's start with the central nervous system, because this is what you think of. It's the brain and the spinal cord, and it is the center of integration and control. This is where you're going to figure out what's going on and send the response. And different animals have different sized brains. We think about ours, and it's a very familiar shape, but you can see that, here's a crocodile brain, a little bit different. Here's a cerebrum and the optic lobe and all of that of a goose, right? So birds. Then there's a horse. This is starting to look more familiar. Here's the cerebrum, right? And then, of course, here's the olfactory lobe and the bird, right? I believe the olfactory lobe's right around here, but then there's the medulla. You can see that here, right? And then it's much larger comparatively in the crocodile. So different brains, different animals, and they're increasing in complexity as you go through the vertebrate groups, right? Anyway, okay. So central nervous system, this and that, yeah, brain and spinal cord, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the brain. What justification is there for the statement, we only use 10% of our brain? Well, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, as you're finishing reading 1 through 4, there is no justification for this statement. It is crazy talk. This is not true at all, right? And as a matter of fact, we use all the parts of our brain. So let's talk about what those parts are really quickly, right? So there's the cerebral cortex, the cerebrum, and it's divided into 4 main areas, okay? Here you have the frontal lobe. This is the thing that makes us really special because for us it's huge, and it's associated with reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, some emotions, and problem solving. And so we have a lot of ability to do those things. The parietal lobe is about movement, orientation, recognition, the perception of stimuli, things like touch, pain, temperatures, right? The temporal lobe is also associated with perception and recognition, but this is going to be auditory stimuli here. And we've got memory, speech, and understanding, right? And then in the back, occipital. And this, what sense is left? visual. The occipital lobe is all about the visual information, okay? Now, if we move into the next system, this is going to be the limbic system, okay? And that's going to be the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. The thalamus is going to relay information, you can see that's right here, is going to relay information between the nerves and spinal cord and the brain, right? And so here it's nerves and spinal cord to brain, yeah? The hypothalamus, this is really important. This is your homeostasis center, right? This is going to maintain all of the systems that keep your body in control and balanced. It's also in control of the, well, that is control of the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about that in just a second. It's going to dictate your circadian rhythms. It's where you have your thirst and hunger centers and some emotion, okay? The amygdala, memory, emotion, and fear, right? And so your fear is going to be here. And we're going to talk about the amygdala versus the cerebrum in just a second. And then the hippocampus, also memory, okay? But this is really important because it's short-term memory to permanent memory. This is learning, and then, of course, spatial relationships. So about all of this emotion stuff, here's just a fun extra question. It is on the mini quiz, though. Which of the following provides evidence that brain circuits involved in emotion form early during human development? Young infants can bond to a caregiver and express fear, distress, and anger. Humans are more likely to be able to recall emotional memories from childhood than factual memories. Infants can understand language before they themselves can speak. Such circuits involve parts of the brains that evolved before the neocortex involved. Individuals with damage to the amygdala no longer have autonomics. Wow, let me try that one more time. That was horrible reading. Individuals with damage to the amygdala no longer have autonomic responses to stressful stimuli. Well, now remember, the question is asking about emotion. So only two of these deal with emotion, and that is 1 and 2. Humans more likely to recall emotional memories than factual memories? Maybe, maybe not. But young infants do bond to a caregiver, and they can express fear, distress, and anger. And so that means that that is something that is going to be early in development. And that's kind of fun to know. All right, now last part of the brain we want to talk about, and the last part of the brain, is the brainstem. And this is sometimes part of what's called the reptilian brain. And so this would form the bulk of the reptilian brain. And so what that is going to be is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And these are your really basic functions, okay? This is going to be vision, hearing, eye movement, body movement, voluntary motor function, okay? This is really important to actually working. A lot of motor control stuff going on here. So the pons is going to be motor control, sensory analysis. This is where you've got movement and posture. And you'll notice that these things also had corresponding areas in the cerebrum as well, okay? And then you've got the medulla, which is maintaining vital body functions, breathing and heart rate. That is also associated with the amygdala. And, oops, I almost forgot. So brainstem was not the last portion we're going to talk about. How could I almost forget the cerebellum? The cerebellum is this portion right here. It's right underneath the occipital cortex, leans up against the brainstem here. And this is responsible for your fine motor control, balance and equilibrium, and your muscle tone. Okay, so let's move on to the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is the nerves, right? And the nerves are going to exit the spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord is actually part of the CNS, and I didn't highlight that, and I didn't show you the structure and everything like that, because unfortunately we're just not going to do that in this course, but it's still part of the CNS. But all of these nerves are going to come out of the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system has 31 spinal nerves and 12 cranial nerves. And the spinal nerves carry information to and from the spinal cord, but there are 12 nerves that actually come directly out of the brain. In some organisms, that's actually 13, but for humans, it's 12. Okay, and this is just a picture of the cranial nerves and what they actually do. And when we were talking about vision and we were talking about balance and smell, all of those senses, you can see, like, here's the olfactory nerve, here's that vestibulocochlear nerve, cochlear nerve. This was the, wait, where is it? Oh, there's the optic nerve, okay. And so those were some of the things that we had talked about. Okay, And then the peripheral nervous system is going to be all about communication, and it's divided into two divisions. There's the afferent division, which is the sensory division, and there's the efferent division, the motor division. And the sensory division does exactly what it sounds like. It will conduct impulses from all of those receptors, mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, right, all of those things. And it will conduct them to the central nervous system, okay? And that's really important because that's how you know what's going on in your environment. The motor division, right, efferent, is going to conduct impulses from the CNS to the reaction portion. So whatever those are called effectors, yeah? And those are typically muscles and glands, okay? Now, the motor or efferent division can actually be divided as well into two different divisions there. And there's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system is your voluntary nervous system, for the most part. And this is going to be your skeletal muscles. Okay, the somatic nervous system is going to talk to your skeletal muscles. Now, the autonomic nervous system, this is involuntary, and frankly, these are all the things that you couldn't think about, right? So like breathing, your heartbeat, glands that are releasing, whatever they need to release to make the appropriate reaction. And this is going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, okay? All involuntary for the most part. Now, this can be divided into two divisions as well. The sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest. Okay, so time for your next question. Which of the following activities would be associated with the parasympathetic division of the nervous system? To release both acetylcholine and epinephrine, to a decrease in blood pressure, increased metabolic rate, dilation of pupils, increased salivation. Well, you want to think about each of these things. Which of these things would be associated with the calm portion, right? So you have these two systems that are in direct conflict. You have the sympathetic, that's all about stress responses. And you have the parasympathetic, which is all about calming down and maintaining, normalcy. So a decrease in blood pressure sounds more like something that would be parasympathetic as opposed to all of these other things, okay? Those are all sympathetic. So in the parasympathetic, right, we call that rest and digest. This is the calming. You conserve and maintain energy. You have a lower heartbeat, lower breathing rate, and lower blood pressure. And then I like this picture because it gives you all of the things, the major things that you've got going on with the parasympathetic system. And then the sympathetic system, stress, stress, stress. Okay, fight or flight. I like to call that fight, flight, or freeze, actually. You're going to release adrenaline and noradrenaline, right? And you're going to increase your heart rate and your blood pressure. This is epinephrine, by the way, the adrenaline. And then you're also going to increase blood flow to the skeletal muscles so you can get ready to do whatever it is you need to do to deal with the stress situation you have. And you're going to inhibit digestive functions because you need all of your resources to be going to your heart, to your lungs, to your skeletal muscles to do whatever it is you need to do. Okay, that also means it's going to relax your bladder, which is why people under stressful and fear situations often wet themselves, just as an aside. Okay, putting it all together, this is the nervous system. CNS is your brain, your spinal cord. The PNS are the motor neurons and sensory neurons. Motor neurons are voluntary and involuntary, fight or flight, and rest and digest, or rumination if you want. All right, now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between the cerebral cortex processing and processing that's done by the amygdala, okay? And so let's say that you have a threat, that you see a snake. I like this little picture because you see a snake, okay? Threat appraisal, right? You have to identify the snake and say, okay, what am I going to do about it? Now, your cerebral cortex, your cerebrum, is going to bring in all of that information and say, okay, what is this? I'm going to process it. I'm going to respond to it. The amygdala, on the other hand, okay, which does pick up individual senses, okay, this is your stimulus response, and it is about simple patterns. It's not about really thinking it through. And so this is why sometimes when you're walking, say, through the woods, and there's a twig in front of you and you jump out of the way because you think it's a snake, and then you actually think about it for a second and you say, oh, that's a twig, right? It was the amygdala appraisal that made you jump out of the way. And then your cerebrum, your cerebral cortex, caught up with that and was like, no, 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 just kidding. Okay. And so I think that's an interesting thing there. And also, just as an interesting side note, people who have the occipital lobe, that visual cortex, damaged will frequently become blind, right? And so they can't see. However, they did an interesting test on people who had traumatic brain injuries that had damaged that visual cortex, causing blindness, and they would show them a computer screen that would flash, and of course they're all like, well, I'm not going to right. And the point was they were supposed to push the button every time they saw the flash, and it turns out that they do really well, like over 90% accuracy, because the amygdala isn't damaged. So while they can't see the picture, right, that you see when you look at things, the amygdala is still interpreting those visual cues, and so it's still doing that stimulus response kind of thing, which I think is really, really cool. Okay, now, nervous tissue, what is that? There are two cell types. There's other things going on here too. This is not the only kind of tissue you have in your nervous system, but these are the two cell types that we want to talk about, okay? The neurons, and these are the things that conduct the signals, and then the neuroglia, and those are all the supporting cells, which we are not going to talk about. We are only going to talk about neurons. Now, there are sensory neurons, there are interneurons, and there are motor neurons. The sensory neurons are going to be one way to the integration system. The interneurons are going to be in the integration system, right, like your brain. And then the motor neurons are going to carry the signal for response. The neurons have the cell body. They have dendrites that receive the signal. They have an axon that transmits the signal to an axon terminal that will either stimulate a muscle or a gland or another neuron, okay? These are actually insulated because this is an electrical signal, and this is really cool. And these are the myelin sheaths. You have these little spaces here that are called the nodes of Ranvier. You don't need to know that, but that's actually really important to how that electrical signal is conducted down the axon, which again, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about. But anyway, the dendrites are going to collect the information to determine whether you're going to generate an action potential to send the signal or not. Okay. All right. Now, basically, you conduct a signal from one end of the neuron to the other, and then across the space that separates that neuron, the axon terminal, to whatever the receptor is, okay, and that should look a little bit like that. Neurotransmitters, this is where they're going to be active. They're going to jump the gap here, right, to stimulate whatever response is necessary here. So, knowing a little bit about neurons, if a neuron lacked an axon, it would be most handicapped in what area? Sexually reproducing itself, producing neurotransmitters, consuming cellular energy, sending messages long distances, or receiving messages from other neurons. The axon is what allows the cell, the neuron, to send messages long distances. And so some of your axons can be like 3 feet long, which I think is kind of cool, actually. But if you didn't have the axon, you wouldn't be able to send messages long distance. Okay, so when we start talking about different kinds of neurons, the input division, part of the process, those are the sensory neurons. Decision making, those are the interneurons. And then the output, those are the motor neurons. This just summarizes what we talked about before. And when you put that whole picture together, right, you have some sort of stimulus. In this case, it's touching a burner, not smart. You have the afferent, right, or sensory pathway. It goes to the integration center. Then it comes back out the efferent pathway, that was the motor, and it stimulates some sort of response. In this case, it stimulates skeletal muscle to pull your hand away from the... Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about really quickly are some evolutionary advances that have led to this amazingly complex nervous system that we find in specifically us, but mammals in general. The central nervous system is capable of summarizing incoming messages before sending an outgoing one, so we're talking about processing. Nerve cells are actually very specialized. Remember, we had different kinds of neurons, right? The brain is compartmentalized into centers that control specific activities. You have the CNS and the peripheral nerves, right? So the CNS and the PNS run through the entire body. And we actually have really complex sense organs that can detect stimuli in very specific manners. Okay. All right. So that is it. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.